It's now my pleasure to introduce the last two speakers of today. Erica Doss teaches in the Department of American Studies at the University of Notre Dame. She has published widely on various subjects in 20th century American art, including most notably for today's symposium, her book, Benton, Pollock, and the Politics of Modernism, From Regionalism to Abstract Expressionism, which was published by the University of Chicago Press. And our second speaker is David Anfam, who holds both a BA and PhD degrees from the Courtauld Institute. He is the senior consulting curator at the Clyfford Still Museum in Denver and director of the museum's newly formed research center. Anfam's writings over the past 25 years include his survey of abstract expressionism from Thames and Hudson, now translated into 3 languages, the prize-winning catalog raisonné of the paintings of Mark Rothko, and he is currently curating a focus show around Pollock's mural, due to open at the Peggy Guggenheim collection in Venice in April 2015. So please join me in welcoming Erica and David.
Hi, everyone. I'd like to thank the Getty Research Institute for organizing this symposium, and thanks to all of you for sticking it out through this late part of the afternoon. In the myth debunking spirit that frames today's symposium, my talk focuses on the arrival and afterlife of Jackson Pollock's mural at the University of Iowa. Part of Mural's mythos is that it was the first, the most notable, and the most dearly beloved modern painting at the university. Not true. Years before Mural arrived in Iowa City in 1951, the university had established a reputation as Greenwich Village West, a progressive center for both American and European modes of modern art. In 1934, for example, Grant Wood joined the art department faculty, upsetting its academic style practitioners with his regionalist version of American modernism. In the 1940s, other American moderns such as Philip Guston and Maurizio Lazansky were hired into the department. In 1945, the university, which was then called the State University of Iowa, began holding annual summer shows of contemporary art loaned from the Museum of Modern Art and from galleries in New York and Chicago. It also began developing an impressive collection by purchasing from these shows, including works by European moderns Jean Moreau and Max Beckmann, and Americans Bradley Walker Tomlin and Theodorus Stamos, whose work we see here. Modern art in Iowa, in other words, was flourishing well before Peggy Guggenheim gifted Pollock's 1943 mural to the university. Moreover, Mural's afterlife has been precarious, both a proudly displayed trophy of American modernism and a pawn in various academic and economic takeover bids. Mural, I suggest, arrived at Iowa as the spoil of victory in a war between 2 styles of modern American art, regionalism and abstract expressionism. And for the past 63 years, Mural's afterlife at the University of Iowa has wavered unsteadily between Midwestern furtiveness and financial acumen, from anxieties about cultural pedagogy and legacy to schemes of monetization. Many have wondered how Mural wound up in Iowa in the first place. When Guggenheim vacated New York for Venice in 1947, dispersing much of the art in her East 61st Street townhouse and her Art of the Century gallery, Mural was on loan at Yale University. I lent it to New Haven for a year as they had a special place for it, she wrote in October of 1948, adding, "But now it is no longer on exhibition." In November 1948, she wrote that Yale had, quote, "hung it for a long time, but now they are too crowded for space, and I do not wish to leave it there anymore." Her letters were addressed to Lester Longman, chair of the University of Iowa's art department. Longman and Guggenheim had been acquainted for some time. Her New York gallery had been a resource for the summer shows of modern art that Longman had organized at Iowa City, and he had seen Pollock's mural on display in the entrance hall to her apartment. And we see a view on the left of that apartment. That's not the Art of the Century Gallery. Their relationship was special enough that in 1947, Guggenheim gifted 4 of her Art of the Century paintings to the university, including Pollock's portrait of H.M. and Irene Rice Pereira's 8 oblongs, both of which had been shown at the university's 3rd summer exhibition of contemporary art. A year later, Guggenheim wrote directly to Longman offering Mural to the university. If you remember, it was shown at the Museum of Modern Art in that show of big paintings, she noted, adding, "If you have big enough place for it, I will be delighted to offer it to you." Longman replied, "We are happy to accept," and made inquiries to the Yale University Art Gallery about getting the painting, which had been, quote, rolled on a drum with the stretchers knocked apart. Informed that shipping costs might total as much as $40, which he declared rather exorbitant, Longman balked, and Mural remained rolled up in New Haven for the next 2.5 years. Finally, after receiving an appropriation of $100 for shipping from the university, cost had gone up while Mural stayed under wraps, Pollock's big painting headed to Iowa, arriving at the university in late October 1951. By January 1952, it was hanging in the art department's painting and mural classroom. And as someone pointed out, the photographer here is not focusing particularly on Mural, but on the classroom. The photograph dates to January 10, 1952, which is presumably the first few days of the semester. And the photographer, who was a photographer employed with the University of Iowa's publicity department, was going around the campus photographing students for the winter semester. Its placement in that classroom was key to Guggenheim's gift. During the interwar era, Iowa developed the most innovative art education curriculum in the country, instituting BFA and MFA degrees and a sort of learn-by-doing methodology that Life magazine enthusiastically endorsed over more staid teaching practices, they said, at, quote, old-time fine art schools like Yale's. In 1936, Longman, a Princeton-trained art historian, was hired to combine the separate areas of studio and art history with the goal of training artist teachers in a creative and historically and theoretically informed liberal arts environment. As he explained in a letter to the New York art critic Emily Genauer, his aim at Iowa was to cultivate, quote, experimental work on a more advanced level so that we may contribute new ideas to the field of art as freely as New York or Paris. He added, in the sciences, it is generally expected that the universities will be in the vanguard of experimentation. I want to be the first to do this in the field of art. Longman's Iowa idea was soon modeled in art departments across the nation, especially in the higher education boom years of the post-war. In April 1947, Life published this photo essay on the 1.8 million World War II vets who were attending college on the GI Bill. And it highlighted the University of Iowa, where vets made up 60% of enrollment, as, quote, typical of American institutions of higher learning. Although Peggy Guggenheim herself was mostly self-educated, her collecting and museal ambitions were often publicly directed, rather than privately isolated. Situating Mural on the University of Iowa's teeming post-war campus met those objectives. So did the Greenwich Village West reputation of the university's School of Art. Funded in part with grants from the Carnegie and Rockefeller Foundations, the university's first art building was dedicated in 1934 on the west side of the Iowa River. And it featured a large central gallery, numerous studios with north light, and an auditorium seating 300. It was a huge draw. Between 1948 and 1962, more MFAs were conferred at the University of Iowa than any other university in the nation. And as these post-war images suggest, modern art of various strains dominated their studies. In his foreword to the catalog of the university's first summer show, which included these works by Pereira and Esteban Francis, Longman explained, "The purpose of this exhibition is to present to the university students and to people in this part of the country a cross-section of progressive painting in the United States. The frontiers of experimentation are shown." His remarks about progressive artistic experimentation were meant as a clear rebuke to the kind of painting that Longman encountered when he arrived in Iowa to chair the art department: regionalism. That was the style of one of the most popular artists of the day and one of the university's most popular professors, Grant Wood. A native Iowan, Wood's national reputation had soared when the Art Institute of Chicago had purchased his now iconic painting, American Gothic, in 1930. Within just a few years, he and fellow regionalist Thomas Hart Benton, seen here on the cover of Time in 1934, were hailed as the leaders of an important new American art movement. Gertrude Stein even picked Wood as, quote, "the first artist of America." Grant Wood was hired at the university in 1934, when studio arts were still housed in the Department of Graphic and Plastic Arts, and art history was housed in the Classics and Archaeology Department. Wood was also the Iowa director of the Public Works of Art Project, the PWAP, and he taught mural painting classes for which university students received both WPA stipends and academic credit. For a while, he ran some of his classes inside an unused swimming pool on Iowa City's campus, far away from the art building and far away from Lester Longman. Suffice to say, the two men did not get along. Wood was opposed to the Iowa Ideas Pedagogical Union of Art and Art History and its professionalization of studio practices, which departed from his own ideas about workshop populism. Incensed that an art historian was in charge of the art department, he complained to the dean that, quote, "an overemphasis of the historical or fact memorizing had damned and diverted the department's creative spirit." Longman, on the other hand, was deeply opposed to Grant Wood's popular and commercial success, believed he spent way too much time away from the classroom, and thought that he was dangerously reproducing an uninformed generation of reactionary artists. Recognizing Grant Wood's threat to his managerial and ideological authority, Longman did everything he could to reassert his own. In 1938, for example, Longman hired artist and future art critic John Kennedy to teach painting. And he hired art historian H.W. Jansen to teach courses in modern and contemporary art. Wood retaliated. After Jansen took students to the Art Institute in Chicago to see a Picasso show, Wood convinced the dean to fire him for teaching pernicious material. Longman fought back, immediately reinstating Jansen, and Iowa art students jumped into the fray by painting a series of Picasso-inspired murals and holding a modern art dance that spoofed the entire controversy of their teachers. Longman next mounted an obsessive campaign of rumor and innuendo accusing Grant Wood of being a bad artist and that he worked from photographs and being queer. All of this simply fueled the larger war that Wood, Longman, and Jansen were really waging over the course of modern American art. Ironically, Grant Wood was originally hired at Iowa as a modern art upstart, challenging the moribund academic tone of Charles Atherton Cumming, who became chair of the art department in 1909. Trained in Paris in the 1880s, Cumming painted portraits and beaux art murals like this one. He taught art the old-fashioned way. Students first drew from plaster cast, moved on to still life, and eventually tackled the human figure. And he was rabidly anti-modernist and racist, maintaining in a series of pamphlets titled, quote, "Democracy and the White Man's Art," and a defense of the white man's art, that modern art's freakish tendencies originated with the colored and primitive races. Grant Wood's faculty appointment at Iowa was intended to displace Cummings' dangerous pedagogical influence and reinvigorate the university's art program, which he aimed to do with regionalism. The regionalism that Wood and Benton developed was a narrative style of modern American art that featured local landscapes, both agricultural and industrial, and people, which Wood depicted planting trees, bargaining over chickens, and singing with the Shriners. During the Depression, their plausible but fundamentally imaginative paintings, Wood's art in particular, is often witty and, in my opinion, just plain weird, were intended as a publicly accessible and uniquely American art for the millions, akin to the cultural nationalism of the New Deal. Benton, in particular, pursued the liberal political possibilities of American modernism, refining his regionalist vision in murals that imagined an integrated worker-determined economy and asserted the democratic values of the American Republic: cooperation, citizenship, hard work, productivity. Teaching at the Art Students League in New York before moving to Kansas City in 1935, Benton's foremost student was Jackson Pollock, who imitated Benton's style and posed for many of his canvases. That's him playing harmonica in Benton's painting on the right. Wildly popular during the New Deal era, aided in part by sales of $5 prints through the Associated American Artists Gallery, the regionalists were also widely despised in the art world, especially by those who were skeptical about their populism, jealous of their commercial success, and anxious about regionalism's overtures to aesthetic nationalism. Jansen, for example, published several essays deriding the regionalist entirely mediocre talent and likening their dangerous art to that produced in the fascist and totalitarian regimes of the Third Reich and Soviet Russia. Likewise, Lester Longman wrote article after article disparaging regionalism as, quote, isolationist, tribalistic, chauvinistic illustration, and arguing that Wood and Benton were, quote, no substitutes for even one good picture by Matisse or Picasso. Such opinions were shaped, of course, by the nation's larger political shift from New Deal to Cold War, whereby the liberal statism that informed regionalism was rejected in favor of a post-war freedom and consensus mindset to which abstract expressionism was attached, not by its artist, but by art critics like Clement Greenberg and Lester Longman. Longman happily added Mural to the modern art collection that he had been building at the university for years, which notably did not include a single work by Grant Wood. In a final taunt to regionalism, Longman declared that, quote, the best place to hang the mural regularly would be in the Mural studio, formerly Grant Wood's base of operation, where it could be used directly in teaching. As Mark Rothko remarked, or perhaps complained in 1955, when he was teaching summer school classes in painting at the University of Colorado Boulder, they all want me to teach them abstract expressionism. At Iowa, Mural was signed on to do exactly the same thing. Yet, Mural's afterlife at Iowa was a struggle, largely because its value as a pedagogical tool was soon displaced by its value in the art market. In 1958, Lester Longman left to head UCLA's art department, whereas Howard Singerman recounts his Iowa idea met new challenges. In 1959, Mural was hanging in the lobby of the University of Iowa's main library. Peggy Guggenheim, hearing that Mural had been demoted to the students' dining hall, not true, expressed her displeasure and offered to exchange the mural for a, quote, very beautiful Brock of 1926, which is in my collection in Venice. The art department's new chair, Frank Seiberling, politely declined. But had Peggy Guggenheim offered, quote, a fine landscape by Gaspard Duget, a really good sculpture of the Riemenschneider school, a landscape by Jawlinski, or a good Tiepolo, they might have cut a deal. Those were the works that Seiberling said he most wanted at Iowa in a series of letters that he exchanged in the early 1960s with various art dealers and galleries, including Christie's and Andre Emmerich, aiming to build an encyclopedic collection of Western European art. Seiberling saw Pollock's big painting as a financial opportunity. The asking price in 1962 was $180,000, more so than an art historical stakeholder. Seiberling was also spearheading a fundraising campaign for a university art museum. Up to this point, Iowa's pretty impressive modern art collection was dispersed all over the campus, including the library and the student union. And you can see on the right side the Beckmann in the student union. Luckily for Iowa, in 1961, Peggy Guggenheim began a lengthy legal battle with Lee Krasner over Jackson Pollock's estate. And university lawyers ultimately advised against selling Mural or even letting it travel to a Pollock retrospective organized at the Marlborough Gerson Gallery in New York, fearing that Guggenheim might try to, quote, recover her gift. Guggenheim got wind of Iowa's art market wheeling and dealing, and in an angry letter to University President Virgil Hancher stated, if you no longer wish to have the mural in your university, I must ask you to return it to me. President Hancher quickly wrote her back, I'm sorry that you've been distressed by this unfounded rumor. We are as pleased to have the Pollock now as when you gave it to the university. Sort of an interesting statement. In 1969, the university opened its first art museum and centerpiece mural in a place of honor. Today's neoliberal economics, however, have yielded more efforts to monetize Mural. In 2007, Sotheby's extended a hostile takeover bid of $150 million for the painting and offered to sell the university's other paintings too, including Beckmann's Carnival. In 2008, amidst the recession, the steady decline in state funding for higher education, and a devastating flood, at which point, Mural was relocated to the Figge Art Museum in Davenport, Iowa. University of Iowa Regent Michael Gartner proposed selling Pollock's painting to offset an estimated $743 million in flood damage on the campus. In 2011, the Regent supported a bill from Republican Representative Scott Raker requiring the sale of Mural to underwrite student scholarships. Providing scholarships to Iowa students is far more important than owning a painting that's not even on the campus, Gartner stated, adding, all organizations regularly look at their assets and ask if that's the best use of their money. As Los Angeles Times art critic Christopher Knight observed, Iowa Republicans have apparently spent too much time watching Antiques Roadshow. Again, luckily for Iowa, university lawyers advised that selling Mural would violate the donor's intent, deter future donations, threaten the art museum's accreditation, and invite future litigation from Peggy Guggenheim's heirs and her foundation, well known for lawyering up. University President Sally Mason, Iowa Governor Terry Branstad, billionaire John Papajohn, a major donor to the university, and UI students and faculty all protested the possible sale. University Art Museum Director Sean O'Hara said the move was, quote, like selling your grandmother. Representative Raker withdrew his bill, telling the press the sale had become cumbersomely emotional. Today, Mural's monetization remains an issue, but that's the afterlife of much modern American art. Fossil fuel magnate Bill Koch paid $7 million for Wood's spring plowing in 2009. Despite the battles waged over them last century, both regionalism and abstract expressionism are today viewed as liquid assets. The key, and perhaps our shared concern, is to re-engage their pedagogical possibilities. Thank you.
As my title suggests, what I'd like to do in this closing talk is to raise a few of these central impulses which I think Mural embodies, to touch upon some of the contextual issues which have been under-researched, but which I think also impacted on Mural's creation, and then finally to give a very short potted history of Mural's legacy, its afterlife into the 21st century for later artists. But before I do that, I want to make two asides. One, very, very trivial. If in the captions you don't see an artist's name, it means it's Jackson Pollock. The second one is rather major because out of the blue, a couple of weeks ago, I got an email from a very dear friend of mine, whom I've known for almost a quarter of a century, and he happens to be a veteran and highly respected dealer based in Los Angeles. And it was very, very succinct. I knew he wasn't going to come to the opening here. He doesn't like big shows of hype and all that. He eschews that. But he said, well, I went up to the Getty, and I stood in front of Mural, and he's a kind of tough, hard-boiled, very experienced dealer. And he said, it's such a great painting, I nearly wept. And the Getty Conservation team have done a heroic achievement. And that short email, it's just unbelievable. It's unbelievable, it's unbelievable. And I feel enormously grateful to the Getty for allowing me to come here and basically be a fly on the wall and have a window on seeing Mural as it was. And I've seen Mural now in 5 different cities throughout the world. Iowa City, Berlin, 1993, London Royal Academy of Arts, 1993, New York, 1998, Kirkbride and those great show, back when that went to the Tate in 99, and now here again in Los Angeles. And to me, Mural feels like an old friend. But the difference is, now it's an old friend that's reborn, phoenix-like, out of its rather withered, varnished, dirty, discolored old age, and it's risen again. And when I finally stood in front of a fully cleaned mural in the conservation studios, I actually talked out loud to myself. I think Yvonne overheard me, she may or may not. And I just said one thing, rite of spring. Mural has that kind of extraordinary, reborn barbaric vitality about it. And there's nothing quite like it. In order to understand Mural, you have to see that running throughout Jackson Pollock's career from the very late 1920s until his death in 1956, you have to see it not just as one continuous trajectory, but rather a kind of oscillation, a kind of dialectical going back and forth between basically two very opposed tendencies. Obviously, Mural we think of above all as being a painting brimming and bursting with action and vitality and energy. It's literally an ambulatory image. It's a preceding processional figures. And the whole idea of Jackson Pollock's technique as a kind of action painter, along with de Kooning and Franz Klein, the very technique of dripping and pouring paint, it literally embodies action. It's totally dynamic. Dynamism is the essence. But what I want to point out is that there's a flip side to that action and dynamism. And that flip side, it occurs very early in Pollock's early work. And just look at the self-portrait of early 30s up here. That self-portrait is totally introverted, totally sort of turned in on itself. And in 1929, Pollock writes in a letter, and this is the exact opposite of the idea of the heroic action painter outpouring his gestures, macho and vital. Pollock writes in a letter early on in his career in 1929, "People have always frightened and bored me. Consequently, I have been within my own shell." So you've got to understand that all the energy, all the action of a later Pollock has its springboard in an initial kind of extreme introversion. And in a 1930 letter, next year, he writes, "The more I think I'm thinking, the darker things become." It's an image of total claustrophobic introversion. And what's rather interesting about the self-portrait, apart from very strange colors, a slightly frightened, wild-eyed effect, and looking almost like an extraordinary kind of baby, very round face, it's much more like some kind of strange image of yourself. You get for the first time a circular spheroid shape. Now, that node, that circular shape, will take many different forms throughout Pollock's work. You will see it turning into the vortex-like thing, influenced by Benton's undulations here. You'll see it taken to an apotheosis in Mural with its undulating loops, which are always there. Even in Pacify, the central womb-like shape is ovoid or egg-like. But that shape recurs, and even in late painting, like Ocean Grayness, 1953, in the Guggenheim, there are nodules throughout the painting, and eyes in the heat, it becomes like an eye. And I want you to remember that kind of shape because it's very, very interesting. And that shape rhymes with the idea of being within my own shell, because after all, a shell is something enclosed, something interned. And another point I want to make is that Mural is an image which goes from right to left. And in a Western culture, where reading goes from left to right, there is something contrary about it, something going the other way, which is quite interesting. It's associated with going a conventional way, left to right. Now, to my mind, there are two implications to that idea. You can say, quite obviously, that the visitors going into Peggy Guggenheim's townhouse were walking past Mural on its left, and they were going the same way. But the very obvious flip side of that is those visitors, unless they went outside the back door when the show was over, the party was over, in walking out through the front door, they would be walking in the opposite direction that Mural was going. So I'm not totally sold on the idea that Mural is a right-to-left image solely because it echoes the way people walked into the house. The idea of going from right to left starts off in going west. And why am I showing Clifford Still? Because Clifford Still's very early sort of fantasized, grim self-portrait in a darkened and wasted valley, as he once said in 1959, is setting out on a kind of spiritual pilgrimage, a kind of Western version of Pilgrim's Progress. But above all, they're going from right to left. And think of it in a very, very simple cartographic way. You look at a map of America, the east is on the right, the west is on the left. Going west literally means going left. Simple as that. So there's that thought behind it. Now, there's another idea. If you see this as being static, introverted, frightened, bored within your own shell, then you have to break out of it. And that breaking out of motion and propulsion starts very early on with the idea of a spiritual journey and voyage. And why am I showing Clifford Still? There's one very key thing. People may not realize that the one artist in the whole of abstract expressionism who was closest to Jackson Pollock was Clifford Still. This is something we now know. Clifford Still could be, in the public eye, a mean son of a bitch. He broke with everyone. His invective and vitriol was legendary. He called the Museum of Modern Art the gas chamber on 53rd Street. He absolutely ran down everyone, with a few exceptions. And the one artist he never broke with was Jackson Pollock. Never. And what we now know is, one, Jackson Pollock was one of the very few artists, his fellow colleagues, who he broke with Rothko, broke with Newman, broke with Reinhardt, all of them, never broke with Pollock. And he told Newsweek, in one of the very rare times he mentioned another fellow abstract expressionist in positive terms, he said, "It was a grand feeling Pollock and I felt out in the West, being able to look out over the mountains, move any number of miles. They were both men of the West. And the key thing which was discovered with the opening of Clifford Still in November 2011, in 1956, when Still had more or less cut himself off from the whole New York art world, and when Pollock himself was going to pieces, we now know that Clifford Still had planned to take Jackson Pollock on a road trip west. Now, tragically, Jackson Pollock took a very different kind of road trip before that could happen. There was a road trip in a car which went into a tree, and that was the end of Jackson Pollock. But the fact that Still felt sufficiently sympathetic towards Pollock to want to drive him westwards is immensely significant. Now, the last idea, the idea of action, we like to think of action as being something we associate with the 1950s, was Howard Rosenberg's famous essay, The American Action Painters. What was to go on canvas was not an event, was not a picture, but an event. Action doesn't come out of existentialism and Sartre in the 1940s. It comes out of the 1920s and 30s. Now, I want to give you one example. A book published in 1939, which Pollock may even have known, was by a vitalist, pragmatist philosopher of the period, now completely forgotten, called Baker Brownwell. What's it called? 1939, published by Harper in New York, Art is Action. Typical quote from introduction. Art is human action, always in action, never the fixed and final structures called works of art. That's almost got a Pollock-like ring, the idea of flux. And then again, page 4, action thus is everything. It is a concrete expression of energy. Don't forget, Pollock will say his work in 1950 is energy and motion made visible. Art is a concrete expression of energy, this Brownwell Baker writes in 1939. It is relative in character. Time is a method of measuring it. And of course, Pollock famously said that the modern artist is working with space and time much later on. Those ideas in the later Pollock of the 40s and 50s, they actually spring from the 1930s. And the whole idea of speed in the 1930s, streamlined locomotives, streamlined buildings, and transparency, glass bricks, Depression modern style, all those ideas really have a root in the 1930s. And there's one thing about that book, Art is Action. One of the artists the author talks about, 8 artists, is Thomas Hart Benton. And I think it's very unlikely that Pollock would have missed that. But the actual point about Mural, if I see a genesis anywhere, it's in 1933, because in a letter of 3rd of February 1933, there is absolutely one crucial thing. Pollock writes, and he's writing about this, although he gets it slightly wrong. Benton has a huge job out in Indianapolis for one of the state buildings. He gets that wrong. He gets it mixed up with Benton's other projects. But he knows about this because Benton is his teacher then. And Benton goes out to Indianapolis to paint these murals for the State of Indiana exhibit, Century of Progress International Exposition in Chicago in 1933. They're temporary things. Interestingly, they're movable because they end up in Bloomington. This idea of a movable mural starts there, more or less. But the key thing is, Benton has a huge job out in Indianapolis, 200 running feet, 12 feet high. The idea of running feet, propulsion, going around the room, which they literally do, it turns these murals of Benton into a kind of frieze, effectively running around the building. And from at least the time of the Pan-Athenaic frieze which ran around the Parthenon, the Elgin marbles now in the British Museum, the idea of a running frieze is associated with perambulation and with propulsive movement, going left to right or right to left. So the origins, as I see it, the ideological origins of Mural lie in the frieze. And you think about these works, they blend into the architecture, they become a kind of quasi-frieze, but internally they also have their own depictions, so they're easel pictures telling a story blown up to a large scale. And the later 1940s equivocation of Greenberg between the easel picture and the mural, the idea of having something which is contained but can be moved around. That can be found there already, in a nutshell, in Benton in the 1930s. Now, one thing I've always thought has been missing from the interpretation of abstract expressionism, very quickly, in a nutshell, when Irving Sardner wrote his canonical book, The Triumph of American Painting, in 1970, Irving's made, in my opinion, one great mistake. It was about painting. Irving could not think about sculpture, was no David Smith, and even less could Irving think about photography. And I'm going to argue that photography was a key thing. That's partly because in 1970, and when Irving wrote a book in the 60s, photography was barely really seen as a fully accomplished art form. That's a much more contemporary idea. When I wrote my little book in 1970, this one here, the reviews were not bad, and I was quite chuffed since I've written on a little Adler typewriter, but I was taken to task for comparing Jackson Pollock with a photo of a skater with lights from Life magazine by an unusual photographer nobody's still heard of in some respects, called Jean Mealy. And the reviewer was Jeremy Lewison, then deputy director of the Tate Gallery. And he said, unless AmFam can somehow prove that there's a connection between this type of photograph and Pollock's work, then the jury is still out. Well, it took me 26 years to prove it. And I want to show you how I proved it. But something I want you to remember, it was Nan Rosenthal, when she did the Pollock sketchbooks at the Met, who identified this rather strange early sketchbook as being based on a cover of Life magazine. And we know Pollock looked at life. Now, I'm going to argue that not just, obviously, a photographer like Aaron Siskind is an abstract expressionist photographer. We know that. I'm going to argue that photography for Pollock was an interface between three-dimensional action, movement, and two-dimensional surface of the picture plane. I'm going to start backwards, because in some classic Pollocks of the 47-48 period, we get these very, very strange patterns which are not altogether Pollockian, and they're not really Bentonian even. And in looking through the pages of Life magazine, 1943, light flack tracers of this kind. These are action photographs from wartime. Here, the light flack tracers produce these very, very idiosyncratic lines. And one of the things, when you see something idiosyncratic in a work of art, it often means it's being catalyzed by something outside, by an outside or external source. And even here, down number 20, 1948, in the Munson-Williams Proctor, the sense of a kind of reign of wonder, of teeming incident, seen from an aerial viewpoint, is remarkably similar to some of the aerial photographs which came to prominence during the war years and were reproduced again and again in Life magazine. But you may not yet be convinced, the jury may still be out. But then we come to an interesting work of 1943, like Burning Landscape. We know from this unusual work of 45 on paper, I think it's on paper, that Pollock was in some way involved with the chaos of the war, the violence and disruption. That's just the title, and we think it's Pollock's title. But look at Burning Landscape. No one's ever really thought about Burning Landscape. Why is it a burning landscape? The same issue of Life has the RAF bombing of Dusseldorf with incendiary bombs. And can you see the incendiary patterns there? These are like the light traces of incendiary bombs. I'm not saying it's a one-to-one thing. You don't literally transpose it. I'm saying that these kind of images of action and motion reproduced all over the pages of Life through the Second World War have to be in Pollock's mind. Now, come up to Mural. I don't like to talk about sources for works because sources imply some kind of passive idea of just being influenced by something. Mural is above all what we call overdetermined, and that term comes originally from Sigmund Freud's interpretation of dreams. He says dreams are overdetermined because so many different things feed into them, memories, fantasies, fears, and so forth. The one thing you can say about Mural is that there's so much feeding into it that you really cannot flypaper it to any single source. But what I'd like to suggest is some of the ideas that fed into it. Pablo Picasso, we know that Jackson Pollock was in a creative struggle throughout much of his mature career with Jackson Pollock. He said, I'm roughly remembering this, he said, well, just when you think you've found something new, that bastard Pollock's already got there. It's what Harold Bloom calls an agon, a creative struggle with a strong predecessor. Well, someone, I have to be honest, it wasn't even me. Someone in 1976 said was obvious what one of the things behind Mural. It's Pablo Picasso's Girl Before a Mirror. Partly because of the repetition, the constant reverberation of the shapes, partly because here you go back with these strange ovoids, which no one has taken much notice of in Mural. Everyone talks about the stick figures, which seem to be there striding across, but what about the ovoids? What starts off as that very interesting idea of a spheroid shell-like shape mutates, and don't forget, the key thing about Pollock is constant metamorphosis of ideas and images, mutates into these round areas. But there's another point which only the Getty's book has brought out to me. I had not realized that amongst the first colors put down on the canvas of Mural are cadmium yellow and a very strong red. And these are very much some of the colors from Picasso. But if you're not totally convinced, there's something else. Along the bottom of Mural are truncated diamonds, little pyramids. And they're very, very odd. Look at the background. They're there. They're cut off by the edge. Simple as that. I'm not saying it's a one-to-one thing because things feed into it. But also, very, very crucially, we get action photography. Now, Mural, as has been made very, very clear, was commissioned early in the summer of 1943, early in the year. Pollock doesn't do much through the summer. Seemed to paint it, or says later he paints it during the summer, in the latter part of the summer. We know it's finished by November 9. Well, something was going on in New York then, and specifically the Museum of Modern Art had an exhibition of action photography, which opened on August the 18th and ran for a month and a day and closed on September the 19th. That was an extraordinary exhibition because there were no less than 132 photographs. It was a blockbuster. And there were various different titles. Some of them were the figure in motion, dancers, which are very important to Pollock. Another thing was war, action photography in war. And another thing, which was even more interesting for the later work, is there's a section on astronomy, photographs of galaxies and nebulae and the cosmos as being in a state of energy and transformation. And don't forget, even if the titles are not Pollock, Pollock has a sense of the cosmos, Big Dipper, reflection of the Milky Way, comet. Those things are going to feed into it, but above all, the whole of action photography, that show, and it's reported in the New York Times by Edward Alden-Joule, who, I'll wrap up in a second, who will be very much critical of the abstract expressionists, Jean Mealy. Jean Mealy was an Albanian-born photographer who basically was reproduced in the pages of life thousands of times from 1937 onwards. And this photo strikes me because a corpulent Alfred Hitchcock, striding from right to left. It could be another idea behind Mural. And then what I'd like to do is just suggest very briefly the afterlife of Mural. Somewhere in the literature, Rothko sees Mural very early on and says, why would anyone want to paint a painting that size? By 1944, he's painted one bigger painting, his biggest painting to date. By 1945, and he has his show with Peggy Guggenheim at Art of his Century. He's done the largest painting of his entire career. The impact of Mural's scale is immediate. Everyone sees it in Peggy Guggenheim's townhouse, and again when it's shown in the Museum of Modern Art, large-scale pictures. Take a very different example. Tony Smith's very interesting because there's an anomalous work by Tony Smith, untitled. It actually got installed in a Smith that in a house that Smith designed in New Jersey, but the house got destroyed, and the mural actually got wallpapered over, and everyone agrees that Tony Smith, who was a close friend of Pollock, was partly inspired by Mural. Robert Motherwell does a huge elegy, one of the biggest after the one in the Los Angeles County Museum, which is actually meant to be a homage to Pollock, placed in situ in Iowa. So it's very, very important to see many people are affected. Lee Krasner, the perambulating figures of an unusual work like Promenade, seem to develop out of Mural. The late Lee Krasners, and this is one of the greatest, they're not so much at coming to terms with Pollock's drip style, they're coming to terms, I won't be a minute, they're coming to terms with Pollock's horizontality. David Smith gets a totemic figure, almost walking out of Mural. Richard Serra deliberately does belts as a response to Mural, turning Mural into a kind of industrialized procession. And finally, Bryce Marden. Bryce Marden's study for the Muses is really Mural transposed into slow time. And it takes Mural forward into the 21st century. And I think this gives you a sense of Mural's extraordinary repercussions and afterlife. Thank you.
So I've got a quick question for each of you, and then we'll open it up. For Erica, I thought that we have not talked very much about the politics surrounding Mural. Richard read the passage from Peggy Guggenheim that Kenneth McPherson and Peggy Guggenheim argued over the decoration for that space. And she said that Kenneth didn't realize that extravagance and ostentation were out of place for a country coming out of depression and into war. But of course, what's unsaid about that is that she felt Mural was appropriate in that context. And I thought whether you would want to comment about that.
Yeah, it's sort of an odd comment that she makes. It seems to contain Mural in ways that I don't think it really gets contained. I can't imagine how much more ostentatious Mural could be. So I'm not sure. Anything to add?
Well, I mean, I think Peggy was an amazing character, and she sometimes made slightly wacky comments. I mean, she was certainly eccentric. I think, you know, the point about Mural is that it's a strange combination of sort of violence, and which reflects the wartime period, but also it's very vital, you know, and a painting, it's an extravagant painting for wartime. That kind of use of a canvas and all that, you know.
At the same time, the idea of having a mural coming out of the WPA era and bringing that into your house might go along with a progressive political idea.
Yes, I think it could in a way. But in some ways it's also reactionary because, you know, the essence of the WPA stuff was art for the people. But now you've got a politicized change where it's art for private collectors, which very much reflects the change in politics of America from the FDR New Deal period, you know, get the art out there for the masses, and now more towards a mandarinization. We'll get the art in here for the collectors, the dealers, the cognoscenti, and all that, you know, for rich people.
Maybe, but I think that Guggenheim's hallway is a very public space. This is not her bedroom. It's not a private living room. It is a space that I think some folks have talked about today in terms of a space that you have to walk through or have to pass through. She was a very social person. So yeah, it's not in a post office, but it's not being hidden away in a private home so much as it's the private social space of Peggy Guggenheim.
And then David, I thought for you, something else we haven't talked about that might go along with what you did mention is this right to left movement that you see in Mural. And you talked about it first in terms of something like music and rhythm with Rite of Spring, and then...
metaphorically, I mean...
Yes, yes. And then in action photography. But that is also, that right to left movement is the movement of cinema, that all major movements in cinema, whether a train going, are always from right to left.
Absolutely on the mark, Andrew. Yes, yes. You know, I mean, there's something very transgressive for Western culture. Obviously, if you read Hebrew, then it's entirely natural to think what we would call back to front. But, you know, Pollock doesn't read Hebrew, he's not even that literate. I think it really goes against the grain. It's like a challenging movement. And I think it's part of the radicality of the painting. We look at it like that, and we look at it back, and it zips away.
Questions?
I won't hear them, but...
I'll repeat them.
Meyer's got one there.
Richard?
This is a question for Erica, but it's inspired sort of by both papers, but I want to direct it to Erica first. And that has to do with the photograph, the great photograph of the mural cut off, partially cut off at the University of Iowa. And so one of the things that interests me about that, and so my question for David about that would be, when it's hung that high, does it really make sense to talk about left to right or right to left anymore? I mean, and also, what about the idea that abstraction doesn't have directionality? But my question for Erica is, was actually that used? Because none of the students at that moment, obviously it's a somewhat posed photographs, are looking at, not only are they not looking at Mural, none of them is painting anything like Mural, and none of the other works on the wall look anything like Mural. And so was it, in fact, what I'm most interested in is pedagogically, was abstract expressionism taught in the 1950s, and was there anyone among the students or among the teachers who was producing work that looked anything like Mural? Because part of what's amazing about that photograph is to think that in 10 years, within the space of 10 years, that work goes from Peggy Guggenheim's townhouse to the wall of that huge classroom. And it's hard to think of two less similar spaces and uses to which it could be put. And that's within its first 10 years of existence.
Right. Yeah. Well, remember, it just got there. It literally got there in late October '51. Then they had to unroll it, and then they have to figure out how they're going to hang the thing. So, I mean, perhaps it's been hung in December, but this is a photo, January 10, 1952. So I'm assuming classes have just opened up for the fall, winter semester. And I can't remember the name of the photographer. Dale, can you remember him? He took photographs at the University of Iowa for 40 years. And he went from classroom to classroom. He did yearbooks. He did, and I keep going through his records hoping to find more pictures of the Pollock, but this is the only one we can find. And it says that it's January 10, 1952. So I trust that the clothing of the boys and girls in the picture really says early 50s. It doesn't say another time period. So it's just arrived. So it's not surprising that they're not painting Pollock yet. But what they're not painting is Grant Wood. So not only has it been a remarkable transition in the 9 years since it left Peggy Guggenheim's apartment, but it's also been a pretty significant shift in terms of what is being painted in the large painting and mural studio. I added the quote from Rothko because Rothko and other abstract expressionist artists who depend on teaching for money are going from state, college to university all over the country and complaining about they want us to teach them how to be abstract expressionist. Well, duh. I mean, you know, you've been in Life magazine. This is the art that we want that students who are pursuing BFAs and MFAs want to do. And of course, the stories are by the end of the 50s and early 60s, it's become the only thing that is being taught. I don't have evidence. I haven't investigated yet who the faculty are at Iowa by, let's say, 55, who are teaching abstract expressionist modes of painting. But I have no doubt that they're there. Maurizio Lazansky is there, and there are quite a few other artists who are working in sort of abstract surrealist tendencies. Yeah, they're not painting big murals, but I don't know if that doesn't mean that they didn't paint big murals.
Actually, I have a point to make. I mean, if you think of mural as a teaching tool, It's a pretty intimidating one, isn't it? You know, it's so monumental, it's so catalytic that you could almost be overwhelmed by it before you really start to know how to paint, in a way.
Well, I think, too, that it's not just a matter of painting Pollock, it's being Pollock. And certainly by 52, and then as the decade would go on, and Capra would write about this, you know, it's all about the persona of abstract expressionism, maybe perhaps more than the style.
Yeah. Kent is the name of that photographer.
What's his name? That's, okay, all right.
Other questions?
Christopher Knight, I think that was who it was who reviewed the Pollock opening. He made a big deal about the fact that in Peggy Guggenheim's apartment, it was hung like 2 inches from the floor. And at the Getty, it was hung a couple feet from the floor. And now, you know, we see the picture of the University of Iowa, it's all the way up on the top. Now, how do you feel that that makes differences for the public viewing it and for the painting itself and how you interpret it at the different levels?
I couldn't hear well enough because you don't have any.
She's noticing that Christopher Knight observed in a review of the show that the painting is hung higher.
Oh, very good point. I should tell a naughty story and a very short one. I was extraordinarily flattered when Yvonne Zaffron in February actually came up to me before it was in place. We had a big photo up there. And Yvonne, I know, flattered me by saying, well, how should it be hung? And I said, well, you know, it's your show and it's your achievement, so hang it how you like. But if I had my way, and I know you'll say this is crazy, I'd virtually hang it on the floor. So low as you humanly can. But of course the obstacle to that is people are going to walk into it. So, you know, in an ideal world, if people know where they're walking and stand back, hang it very low and in a low space. I like a sense of compression. But you know, you have to be practical in a museological sense, so it has to be hung a bit up. But to me, it's something you confront almost at ground level.
I'm intrigued by the idea of hanging it low to the ground, much as it was originally. I don't think hanging it higher has any more pedagogical purpose than hanging it I mean, I don't think that that's the way you have to do it, but I think hanging it lower does turn it into sort of what Richard Meyer was talking about in terms of interior decoration, the challenge of making something in space, inside, and challenging the idea of wallpaper. And I think Pollock is up to that in its original installation in her apartment.
Hi, this is a question for Erica. I'm sure you're probably already aware of this, but I was really struck in your kind of narrative of the conflict between regionalism and abstraction, that something very similar was happening in literature at the same time, and there was a sort of regional literature of the 30s that was very, you know, far to the left, but kind of got erased and expunged from the canon as high modernism became, you know, part of the academic instruction. I mean, Al Philrice has written about this extensively in a couple of books. Is that part of the broader context of a project you're working on? I'm wondering sort of what's the next step for the research you've started here, and how you would tackle the kind of larger contexts of, you know, other arts, or a kind of concerted effort to pit these two versions of modernism against one another?
Oh, well, that's a good question. I'm actually writing a new book on 20th century American moderns and religion. So, but let's say this: there are multiple modernisms. There are multiple American modernisms, and I think it's interesting for us in the 21st century to start re-engaging those ideas rather than assuming that there's just one, or it is a post-war abstract expressionist sort of modernism. And that's what some of my earlier work has been about, and in a sense what I continue to write about. And you're absolutely right. This is not only going on in literature, but it's going on in architecture, and it's going on in all sorts of cultural expressions, including filmmaking. So.
Erica, one thing I found interesting in that context is that their desire to turn Iowa into a place that rivals New York and Paris for art probably doesn't happen in the visual arts, but does happen in literature.
Yes, totally.
Where
Sure.
Iowa has produced as many.
Well, Iowa becomes the major, writing center for creative writers to the present day, and so many people are coming out of Iowa. It's kind of extraordinary. I think that some things happening at Iowa, and I think part of the story is to figure out what happens to Lester Longman at UCLA. So hopefully there are people in the room who know or are interested in that story. Lester Longman really believed that when you work in the academy, you uphold an academic understanding of making art and teaching art. And he really expected the artist who worked for him and the sort of artist teachers that were being trained to live out the academy. He was very upset with Wood and then other artists that he encountered at UCLA who became engaged in or played in the market, which artists have always done. In the early 60s in Los Angeles, the market is exploding for Southern California artists in new and different ways. He was very disturbed by that, and probably for all the right reasons. I'll just leave it at that. I think he makes a big mistake, too, in assuming that that kind of creative experimentation of the arts is similar to the sciences. He'd probably be very upset seeing how and what the sciences mean in the academy today. I mean, they're all sort of the same. But
I think we have to stop there, and I want to thank all the participants, not only of today, but of the study day yesterday, for a really extraordinary couple of days. And all of you, please look for a publication to come out of this in the next year or so. First joint publication of the Getty Museum, Conservation and Research Institutes. So please join me in thanking everybody, and please join us at the reception right outside.